myself off.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company, and to this, the final event of the summer season. After tonight, we're taking a month off, back on 5th of September, so keep an eye on our website and our newsletter. And what an event to finish on. Let's begin. On the 21st of December 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu stood on a stage in Palace Square to address a bussed-in crowd assembled from the population he'd oppressed and brutalised for more than 20 years. In the past, his speeches have been received with terrified silence, with strained cheers, with sycophantic applause. Not this day, however. This day, somebody in the crowd started heckling. Ceausescu demanded silence, but instead of obeying, others joined in. At that moment, he knew, and more importantly, the Romanian people knew, that the spell had been broken. The tyrant had become the clown. Within days, the regime was deposed. In Enemies of the People, Sam Jordison does the heckling so that we don't have to. Or rather, no, he's done the background reading so that we have the ammunition to hurl at the men, and as Sam writes, nearly always men, nearly always white, who are determined, or so it seems, to disprove the notion that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. Enemies of the People casts its net widely, taking aim at historical figures like William the Conqueror, Adolf Hitler and Henry Ford, modern-day monsters as pictured, and lesser-known enemies like Thomas Midgley Jr., John Romulus Brinkley, and your granny. Yes, your granny, sir. And yes, yours too, madam. It's an angry book, but it's also funny, excruciatingly so, because what better weapon is there than humour to expose the ridiculousness of one's enemies? Know that yellow-trousered egg burp and pound shop mini Hitler are just two of the many superb barbs that will be added to your armoury by the end of this book. I'm sure this evening we'll hear many more of those. Sam Jordison is a journalist, author and publisher. He writes regularly for The Guardian about books, publishing and urban political issues. He is the author of several best-selling books, including the Crap Towns series, the I Spy for Adult series, and Literary London, co-written by Eloise Miller. He's also the co-director of the award-winning indie publisher Gallybeggar Press, through which he's introduced unsuspecting readers to the likes of Emma McBride, Paul Ewan, Alex Phoebe, among others. Please join me in welcoming Sam Jordison to Shakespeare and Company. So Sam, let's talk about the genesis of this book, because this is something. I mean, this is a very topical book. Obviously, we know that publishing can be a very monolithic beast. Sometimes you write a book, it sort of gets scheduled for a year and a half, 2 years in advance. But this one is very contemporary. So how was it born?
Well, the truth is that my editor, I'm very lucky, came to me and said, "Do you want to do this?"
Okay.
And immediately I was like, yes, I was born to to write this, because obviously, like a lot of people, it's been on my mind what the terrible things that have happened and have gone wrong. So this was in probably February, I'm going to say. Okay. And 6 weeks later, the book was written. Uh-huh. So it was quite an extreme bit of stunt writing. So it wasn't the normal publishing schedule at all, and then they got it out at the start of June. So. And
did you feel? I mean, clearly your editor felt it was the book you had been born to write. Did you? Did it come easily, or was it sort of? Did it have to be dragged out of you over those 6 weeks?
I don't know. Maybe my wife is the best person to ask about this, but yeah, quite often it did feel like I was just kind of cranking it out and downloading. But there was a lot of intensive research and fact checking, because facts are very important, and
particularly when you're insulting people.
Yeah, when you're insulting people, but facts are one of our weapons in the ongoing struggle. So there was a lot of intense work and writing, but one of the nice things when you're working to such an extreme timetable is you don't really have time to think about it and worry about it and go over things again. You just have to sit down and do it. So I did, and luckily it came out. It was okay. And I think, I've looked at it, for a while. I went through the editing process and then couldn't stand to look at it. And I looked at it again recently. I thought, yeah, there's some things I'd change and reword, and there's a few rough edges. But then again, that's kind of part of the nature of the book, and it. I was angry when I wrote it, and so you get that sense from it. I guess I don't know. You read it,
and also like you say, some things you change as well. And this is one of the things, kind of. I think particularly, I mean, you know people now, they kind of wake up in the mornings and they check the news, I think specifically where Trump is concerned, and like, so, oh God, what has happened now? What has changed now? I mean, did you feel that pressure when you were writing it, that sort of, that the world could be such a different place in even 2 months after you'd written the book?
Yes. So in the UK, of course, we had the general election, which I knew nothing about when I was writing the book. So I filed the book, everything was ready to go to press, and Theresa May called a general election and threw all the pieces up into the air again. And I was going to say, luckily, everything stayed pretty much the same, but it's not really luckily for the world that things didn't change too much.
Yeah, and I think kind of the fundamentals hold true. I mean, even if the sort of there's been a bit of a kind of musical chairs, perhaps a little bit, but still, I don't think there's anything in there that, as a result of what has happened, you would disown now. No,
obviously I'd probably, in fact, if it goes to reprint, I will revise the chapter on Jeremy Corbyn and update that, but I'd probably be even more enraged at
And before we get on to some of the specific examples, let's just talk about the title. Because this is something, obviously, that a few months before you started writing the book became a very sort of politically charged... Well, I mean, it would have always been politically charged, but it was given a new kind of modern resonance because of something the Daily Mail...
Yeah, I mean, it's a horrible thing, and it's something that, of course, I'm going to immediately break the first law of the internet and start talking about the Nazis, but enemies of the people was, a big phrase that Goebbels would use. And... in Britain, after the Brexit vote, there was a court case. I'm presuming quite a few people know this story, but to try and ensure that there was a parliamentary vote about instituting Article 50, which they were just going to go ahead and do without that. And so someone brought court case, say, look, we have to have the rule of law, rule of parliament, and the judges that decided yes, this was okay. Well, this is what we have to do, this is the law of the land, and we have things to protect, were declared enemies of the people in the Daily Mail and other right-wing places. So it's pretty unpleasant. So.
That's one of the things. It's incredibly unpleasant, and yet sort of almost. And this is one of the things I think we'll come back to talk about, like the absurdity of some of the things that are hurled about. Like, so I think it was just online, not in print, but the Daily Mail referred to one of the judges as if everyone should be scandalised as, and I quote, an openly gay ex-Olympic fencer.
Yeah, and like openly gay. Like, didn't we dispense with that kind of language in the decades ago? Like.
And also ex-Olympic fencer, like, are we meant to be outraged that he given up, that he...
That's right, yeah.
So let's come on to talk about some of the sort of specific types of people. And as I was reading it, I was kind of breaking it down into, let's say, different groups. And I guess unsurprisingly, and particularly with the 4 that are illustrated on the front, one of the principal sort of contributors as types is politicians, obviously. And maybe we can begin by hearing a little extract about, from our friend on the left there, on the box, Vladimir Putin.
Okay, let's hear about
Who Putin. Is the first in the book, actually. Before you read it, why did you put him first?
So the book... It does follow a kind of... I hope as you read through, there's a logical order. It tells a story of how we got to where we are. And it actually goes back after Putin to a few economists who we'll maybe talk about in a bit. But Putin essentially feels like the puppet master, doesn't he? He's been holding the strings and in one way or another is behind an awful lot of things, and also represents, he's symbolic of the rightward authoritarian shift that we've been undergoing. So let's hear about Vladimir Putin. If Vladimir Putin had a better penis, life would be safer and kinder for all of us. As it is, the world's most obviously overcompensating politician has bare-torsoed himself into the history books by interfering in numerous elections, invading his neighbours, and corrupting political debate around the world. And that's before we even mention the way people who oppose him keep on having allergic reactions to bullets and poison. I should interrupt myself at this point because... obviously, when you write a book like this, you're quite worried about the legal report that comes back once the lawyers read through it. And actually, they didn't come back with very much at all. But I had...
And don't worry, we checked that bottle was sealed before you...
I have to be careful now what I'm saying when I'm being recorded, but I had maybe accidentally inferred that Putin has killed some journalists in the past. And this was the one thing I had to clear up from the legal reports, to say that, you know, journalists had died in mysterious circumstances. Oh, you'll see the wording in a minute. But okay, we don't necessarily know that Putin has erectile dysfunction. Plenty of biographies attribute his fondness for working out and chucking people around on judo mats to the fact that he's just 5'7". The theory goes that when Putin realised he was hitting puberty later than the other boys at his school, and that they were outgrowing him, he decided that he'd have to learn some sick martial arts skills if he were to maintain his position as their chief bully and tormentor. And Putin has actually boasted in the past about how good he was at bullying at school, so it's not something I've just made up. Even so, there is something about all those photos. His press office release of him taking topless summers in Siberia, biceps rippling as he casts out fishing lines, pecs glowing as he rides bare-chested on sweating stallions, and shoulders straining as he swims. Butterfly, naturally, it's the toughest stroke, in icy lakes. You've also got to wonder about his release of an 80-minute video called Let's Do Judo with Vladimir Putin. Again, if you want a YouTube treat, Let's Do Judo with Vladimir Putin is there for you. And also, about the occasion, he boasted to George W. Bush that his dog Connie was bigger, stronger, and faster than Barney, the US president's dog. And finally, it's hard not to worry that just about the only time we've seen Putin smiling in front of a camera was when he allowed that same Labrador to interrupt a press conference with Angela Merkel, knowing full well that the German Chancellor had been terrified of dogs ever since she was bitten as a child. Sorry to interrupt myself again, but... go and look at pictures of that on YouTube. It is incredible. Putin is there, big chested cat grin, and Angela Merkel, who you admire all the more after watching the photo, because she really does have a serious dog phobia, is kind of sitting there, but not, you know.
It's not a small dog either.
It's a Labrador, but it's, you know, so if you've got a dog phobia and it's right next to you, but not running away, kind of, you can see her holding it together in a pretty impressive way. Okay. Such no-willy waving can also be seen in Putin's domestic and foreign policy. Because if there's one thing that makes Putin feel better than riding and swimming, it's annexing and fixing. Dozens of journalists have been assassinated while he's been in the Kremlin. Russian troops have stormed into the Crimea. He has funded and bolstered far-right-wing political parties all over Europe. Russian agents and hackers work to change the outcome of the last US election. And there's more than a whiff of their involvement in the Brexit vote too. Putin has woven so many complicated webs that it's impossible to know where his influence ends. But perhaps the biggest mystery about this master of secrets and misinformation is that any of his behaviour should have surprised us. And yet, somehow, during the 2012 US presidential campaign, in those happy days when Mitt Romney was the craziest thing the Republican Party could throw at us, and the man who once took a 12-hour road trip with his dog strapped to the roof of his station wagon named Russia as America's top geopolitical foe, Barack Obama joked in return that the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. But for once, Romney was right. Westerners might have hoped that they had won the Cold War, but Vladimir Putin had never stopped fighting it. The clues were all there. We might have had some indication from the fact that Putin was an ex-KGB hardman. After all, the KGB was rather better known for spreading fake news and murdering dissidents than it was for its friendly tolerance of liberal democracies. But just in case we didn't spot that glaring indication, and soon after he burned all his files from his East German posting, Putin declared the fall of the Berlin Wall and collapse of Soviet Russia the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Then, in his first speech, after he came to power in Moscow, he made dark threats about anyone who dared to oppose Russia. And he made good on them by invading Chechnya and killing tens of thousands of people. He also quickly took control of Russian TV channels and started putting out relentless pro-himself and anti-Western propaganda. He had journalists arrested. It was just like the bad old days of communism. Except now, instead of being the enforcing arm of a political party, the Secret Service, now renamed the SFB, pretty much ran the government. Another thing that remained constant from the days of the KGB was the way Putin's opponents kept dying in mysterious circumstances. And when I say mysterious, I actually mean really quite crazily obvious circumstances, like when Alexander Litvinenko made the mistake of accusing Putin of running a mafia state and said that he arranged the execution of journalist Anna, sorry I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Politkovskaya, and she in turn had foolishly accused Putin of arranging the bombing of several apartment buildings in Moscow as a pretext for declaring war on Chechens, and had been assassinated on the comb-over kleptocrat's birthday. Anyway, Litvinenko was killed when two men from Moscow tricked him into drinking tea laced with a rare radioactive poison, polonium-210. A poison that came from a Russian nuclear reactor and left traces all over London, literally showing the assassins' footprints as they moved in on their victim, not to mention the radioactive towel they used to clean their hands afterwards. Putin's attempts to interfere in elections have been just as unsubtle. Banks close to Putin have loaned millions of pounds to French fascist Marine Le Pen. Funny money sloshed around pro-Leave organisations in the UK's Brexit referendum. Several MPs have further accused Putin of interfering in our 2015 general election. And then there's Donald Trump. There are the Russian hacks of the Democratic National Congress and the way they were leaked during election season. There are the funny stories about Trump being filmed taking a golden shower in a Moscow hotel and subsequently blackmailed. There are the less amusing repeated contacts between Trump affiliates and Russian agents during the run-up to the election. There's the fact that Putin sent Donald Trump his congratulations within an hour of Clinton's concession. Putin may now have reason to regret helping out this most wild and unpredictable valets, but it's worth remembering that when the Russian Duma heard the election result, the gathered assembly broke into applause. It's also worth remembering the way Trump quickly appointed Rex Tillerson as his Secretary of State, in spite of the fact that he has billions of dollars of financial interest in Russia, and the Kremlin had awarded Tillerson the Order of Friendship in 2013. Putin's left a trail as glowingly radioactive as the polonium that did for poor old Litvinenko. There's little doubt that vital parts of the current US administration are in Putin's trouser pocket. Worse still, we all know there's plenty more room in there for other world leaders.
Thank you. So I guess I wondered, after reading this, sort of, the question that came to mind was, is it that assholes become politicians, or do politicians become assholes? Do you have any insight into that after having researched the 20 or so politicians in this book?
Do I have insight into this? I don't really. I think I can go back to, was it Solon the lawmaker who said that the best kind of politician is the politician who doesn't want to be a politician. And you know, the old cliche, no matter who you vote for, you always get a government. That goes back to ancient Greece. And early on, in Greek democracy, they had a system of picking out lots for important offices, because they knew the people that wanted to be politicians would always be bad news, essentially. Yeah. Is that really an answer? I think generally most of the people in the book they were corrupt before they became politicians. So it's not really a question of power corrupter.
Because we have stories of Nigel Farage at school singing Nazi songs and parading around in kind of pseudo-Nazi uniforms and so things that he denies, we should say, in case, and I look right at the camera there, in case any lawyers are watching on YouTube. And then you do get that impression that there's this kind of either an underlying anger to these people, or some sort of poison in their background before they get to these kind of positions.
Yeah, essentially, I think certainly the people in this book, and I guess one of the things that I was interested in writing about the book is historical theory. Don't worry, there's not too much in the book, but there's always been, for a long time, if I talk about the great men of history, you'll know immediately what I'm talking about. Big Victorian books about important men who changed things. Julius Caesar, the great geniuses who shaped the world in their image. And then along comes Marx and economic theorists and lots of people who say, no, history is not caused by individuals at all. It's this, series of events based on hunger and everything else, lots of different social things that are going on in industry, and men don't really have much of an influence. I notice I'm saying men, but this is how it tends to be. And, you know, there's some kind of truth in both of those theories. But the thing that hasn't really been explored, which I think is much truer, is that it's not great men, it's idiots, it's wallies, it's fools. It's the kind of people that want to be politicians, the kind of people that think they have a right to rule over others.
And a kind of fundamental lack of complexity as well. You get the idea that if people can see sort of every side to something, they might not be so vociferous in their words. But like these are guys who have an opinion and they stick to it, and regardless of
the facts.
Of the facts,
yeah, absolutely.
And also before, and you mentioned Ayn Rand. I don't know, and we don't seem to have settled on it. But
did we have someone?
Anne, are we going for that? Makes it much easier for me. Ayn Rand. Now we're in a bookstore, and we like to think that literature is in some way an improving force, and yet this particular writer, as you talk about in the book, is in some way responsible for shaping the sort of economic and political philosophies of many of the other people in the book. Yeah.
So Ayn Rand, for people who don't know, is a huge influence, particularly on the Republican Party in the USA, but also in Britain. Lots of the pro-Brexit people. There's a guy called Daniel Hannan who loves Ayn Rand, and lots of Wallies in the Tory party. And her theory, essentially, she has a philosophy of something she called Enlightened SelfInterest, which is a fancy way of saying just be a bastard. And, you know, what you want is the best thing, and it's an extreme libertarian, you should never be taxed. But it's more insidious than that, because as well as creating an excuse for people to be as selfish as possible, it also really castigates unfortunate people and creates, you know, it's the classic thing. It calls them moochers, it others them, and makes them into an evil subclass who are the enemies of progress and should be stamped down, and who should not be given anything, and who you should think of as less than human and treat accordingly, which, you know, has permeated our politics. So she has been a huge malign influence. Also, she's a terrible writer.
I can't remember which one it was, but one of them sounds almost admirably bonkers. I mean, it's completely out there for a plotline. I mean, Thomas Pynchon would have nothing on her for sort of for balminess.
Yeah, well, in fact, the Fountainhead as well, but Atlas Shrugged in particular, which is, you know, yay big, and it has 150 pages given over to a radio broadcast to a guy just downloading this extreme right-wing, boring, huge rant. So artistically it's disastrous, except it does have all these ray guns and adventures, lots of sex, and lots of really unpleasant sex. It's all a bit rapey and horrible, and in fact Donald Trump really likes Ayn Rand, and you kind of, this is not.
And again, I guess this is kind of connected to the question about, you know, politicians and arseholes. Like, do you think she influenced these people, or they just kind of, they found her book and therefore sort of, because they saw reflections of their own opinions, they kind of raised her up?
I think it's a kind of a symbiotic thing. She does influence people, and I think she together they just start spinning around and going faster and faster and faster. So Ayn Rand gives these people the excuse they need to behave, you know, the license to behave as they want to behave anyway, and have been behaving, and kind of makes them think they have a philosophical justification for it. Although if you read it, you'll kind of see that this philosophy is pretty thin. But also, you know, she also reinforces these beliefs and pushes them ever further, and, you know, it's very hectoring, very angry, very much, if you don't believe this, you're wrong. No, well, not just wrong, you're kind of, you yourself are immoral and a burden on society and everything.
And on the subject of being a burden on society, I think it's one thing which is not just in her biography, but in several biographies of the people in this book, this sort of when it comes to the crunch, there's a hypocrisy there as well, because when she was sick, I think it was with lung cancer at the end of her life, she used all of them, you know, she became kind of dependent on the Medicaid system that she had excoriated her entire life.
Yeah, so she had her last few years entirely dependent on the state, and then was buried by her acolytes who hadn't particularly helped, I don't think, with a huge gold dollar on her casket. And one of her acolytes, incidentally, was Alan Greenspan, who became the chair of the Federal Reserve, who oversaw essentially the subprime crisis and set out the conditions that allowed that. So you can see the direct effect she has had on our lives and the world economy.
And that dollar sign is sort of makes a perfect transition to the next kind of group of people I was going to talk about, which are the business people, and again, seemingly principally businessmen. Actually, let's just take a quick aside. Why so many? Like, why? There's probably, I think of the 50 or so in here. There's maybe about three or four women.
A couple of cartoon frogs.
Yeah, if you include your granny and an extra one. But like, did you? I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but did you have any insights into? Is it just the way history has gone, or is there something fundamentally unpleasant about men?
What can I say about this? I think to an extent it is just, the unfortunate fact of history that men have been dominant for so long, and so in a way naturally have done most of the bad stuff, as well as maybe, until quite recently were responsible for lots of scientific breakthroughs and things, just because there wasn't opportunity for women in the same way. But do I want to go further than that? I mean, from reading the book, and I've read the Putin entry, and there is a particular testosterone issue here of men who are overcompensating and insecure, and you just need to look at Donald Trump, and obviously there's something uncomfortable about their manhood and the way they push that, and the abusive patterns it's led them into. So I think, I don't want to push it too far, but it's hard not to draw that kind of conclusion.
Moving back to the businessmen, and now one of the entries in this book, I think we can quite legitimately call your nemesis. Now, if any of you have picked up the Courrier International this week, the current issue, Sam has a lot of form for the Gallibegger Press newsletter of taking a paragraph or two or 12 or 15 to give us an update on his opinions about Jeff Bezos, who just today it's been announced has overtaken Bill Gates as the richest man in the world. Now, it's not that I just want to sort of unleash you upon him, but being in an independent bookstore and a place that values bookstores and independent publishers and sort of diversity in literature, take it away, Sam.
Yeah, what can I say? As someone who treasures a shop like this, and I work in publishing, and Jeff Bezos essentially has been trying to destroy the things that I love, so I take it very personally. And it's not an exaggeration to say he has been, almost for a sport. In fact, a few years ago he had a project running to kind of undermine publishers, essentially, or different people say that were different. Amazon obviously wouldn't say it was to undermine publishers, but whatever. It was called the Gazelle Project because he was going to hunt them down like a gazelle on the savannah and tear them apart at the throat. So you get an
Giveaway,
idea.
Isn't it?
Which kind of gives you an impression of.
Might we have a little extract of the Bezos section?
Okay, let's find the page.
Just in case I wasn't clear, in this week's Courrier International, one of Sam's newsletters was actually picked up and translated into French, so you could see if you're looking how to kind of outrageously insult somebody in various quite violent ways in French, pick up the Courrier International and compare and contrast.
Yeah, I should say, unfortunately, it's last week's actually, because I was going to try and pick one up and bring it, but yeah,
I'm sure it's
changed
online.
Today. Yeah, hopefully it's online. Okay, let's. Jeff Bezos. One of the early names Jeff Bezos thought of using for Amazon was Relentless.com. It was a name that embodied his personality and philosophy, a tireless, persistent urge to build bigger, better and faster, to laser focus on customer satisfaction, to work harder and longer than almost anyone else on the planet. Relentless instead became the brand name for a drink containing scary amounts of caffeine. Bezos himself just became more and more scary. The fact that he's now one of the world's richest billionaires, richest, full stop, we learned today, with his own space program. Did you know this? That Jeff Bezos has a space program, like just to the ultimate Bond villain. Kind of, he has a crazy laugh and a space program. So all that to measure of his success, and how much we should fear him, and a measure of how close he is to becoming. Oh, there you go. I've just cracked my own joke twice. A real life James Bond villain. The old ones are the best ones. Like many of Bond's best opponents, Bezos is supremely intelligent, not to mention a superb businessman. In fact, this was one of the depressing things about this book. So Bezos, my nemesis, as Adam said, by the end I was like, well, he's not as bad as the rest. At least he's clever. But he's changed the way the world shops, consumes media, and even the way it thinks. That we now expect instant access to any product we want is largely thanks to Jeff Bezos and his everything store. But Amazon's success has come at a price for everyone else. Amazon has always argued that it's in the nature of technology to disrupt traditional industries, and that those who are against them are against the future. But the problem doesn't arise from their technological innovations so much as the way they're used. Luddites have always been misrepresented. Even in the good old machine breaking days, King Lud and his followers weren't objecting to the new equipment in the mills they worked in so much as the way their bosses were using them to lower wages and ruin their lives. Likewise, the trouble with Amazon isn't that they make interesting gadgets, it's the way that they use them. Here's the Gazelle Project. Back in the days when it was mainly a bookstore, Amazon had a program called the Gazelle Project, so called because, as Bezos had said in a meeting, the aim was to pursue small publishers like a cheetah would a sickly gazelle. Amazon started to use the fact that they had a near monopoly on backlist sales to leverage ever deeper discounts from their hopeless prey. They then graduated to treating bigger companies with similar ruthlessness. Amazon has used bookselling as a Trojan horse to gather up user metadata, build up users, and bust into hundreds of other sectors. They've made a huge customer database and built up ever more capital to give it a tremendous market power. Several times in the past, Amazon has taken huge losses to undercut its competitors on price and force them to selling up to Amazon. There are other prices associated with Amazon's cost-cutting. In 2014, the International Trade Union Conference gave Bezos the not at all coveted World's Worst Boss Award in recognition of his inhumanity. It isn't just that Amazon has prevented its staff from unionising with its associated benefits. Even executives have been reported to have left the company suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, thanks to gruelling workloads and the moral challenges associated with working for the company. And towards the bottom of the supply chain, in the vast order fulfillment warehouses, have come the horror stories. There have been reports about Amazon hiring private ambulances to wait outside while workers toiled away during heat waves. This happened in the Lehigh Valley, in the middle of Arizona, I think. And eventually, an emergency room doctor, there were so many people being taken in the ambulances, he called in federal regulators. And the reason was, it was cheaper than air conditioning to have just have the ambulances waiting outside. And there have been other stories about low-paid workers sleeping outside warehouses in tents during December in Scotland in 2016. This latter because they wanted to save travel costs and were so fearful of missing shifts. Inside that warehouse, meanwhile, working conditions were said to be intolerable, with huge pressure to meet targets, penalties for taking sick days, and water fountains running empty, even though workers had to walk up to 10 miles a day. Meanwhile, the multi-billion-pound company has become notorious for avoiding taxes. In 2015, Amazon registered $6.3 billion in sales and paid out just $9.8 million in tax in the UK. Over the years, it has been similarly successful at minimising its bills around the world. And so it is that Amazon has also helped unpick the fabric of our society. It isn't just that it has put so many thousands of independent retailers out of business, eaten into the profits of several major industries, and built itself dangerous monopolistic powers. It's that it has deprived us of all the money we could be using on essential services. It has undermined the strength of our democracies. It has added to the feeling that we are cut off and detached from the centres of power, to the feeling that while we're left scrabbling around on the increasingly hard and dirty ground, our hard-earned money is being used to blast billionaire playboys into orbit. But hey, at least you don't have to leave the house to buy Ayn Rand books, butt plugs, or Nicolas Cage pillowcases.
I said in introduction that you cast your net widely, and of course, we've taken in politicians, we've taken in business people. At times, you go after some religious figures too, as well as representatives of religion. So Jerry Falwell comes in for quite a roasting. And although it's funny because in the Nixon section, you introduce the idea of the silent majority, and then when you start talking about Falwell's moral majority, and suddenly the silent majority sounds quite appealing.
Yeah.
But sometimes there are things that can't quite be encapsulated by one person, or these kind of existences which take on a form of their own. And I think one thing I'd like to talk about before we start opening to questions from the audience is Pepe the Frog, which for me was something had been kind of on the sort of the periphery of my consciousness for a while. I'd seen this image, but I had no real understanding quite of what it was. So can you maybe give us a little rundown of this
pep talk?
Yes. Of this particular enemy.
Okay, so how many people here have heard of Pepe the Frog out of interest? Okay, so roughly half. Some people no idea, and so you're kind of as baffled as Hillary Clinton was, who I'll get to towards the end of this sad story. Pepe the Frog was just a nice cartoon of a frog. I'm going to say the guy's name. I think it's called Matt Ford. He ran a cartoon that he started putting online, and there was this frog who was pretty cool, pretty laid back, bit of a stoner maybe, the suspicion was, and so the internet picked up this frog and this nice green smiling picture. In fact, there were 3 or 4 poses he would do. There'd be the kind of confused Pepe, the smiling Pepe, the everything's cool man Pepe, and these would start getting passed around the internet, and various pop stars would start passing them around, and it became a fairly famous meme within these communities. And then on various internet message boards like 4chan, where there are some pretty unsavoury alt-right groups that kind of communicate online, they decided to basically make Pepe their own and started putting swastikas in his eyes, and started making him say horrible fascistic things, and he became their symbol of being a unpleasant Nazi. And whilst all this was happening, an unpleasant Nazi was running for the White House, and these alt-right people were supporting Donald Trump, and they started kind of putting yellow hair on Pepe the Frog and making Donald Trump Pepe the Frogs and have him saying Donald Trump things. And lo and behold, I think it was Donald Trump Jr. started picking up on this and started tweeting Pepe the Frog things. And there was the probably the most famous incident came about when a Democrat said that people who were going to vote for Donald Trump were deplorable, which incidentally is a terrible political thing when you say that these millions of people are deplorable. And not only these millions of people, you might not like them, but they have mothers and they have family and everyone else, and you call them deplorable. It's a hugely alienating thing, one of the terrible things that possibly helped lose the campaign. Anyway, the deplorable thing happened, and there was the Hollywood film. What was the film called?
The Expendables.
The Expendables. The Sylvester Stallone and Schwarzenegger film, and they have the poster with all these guys on the Expendables, and someone made a deplorables poster with Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr. and Pepe the Frog appeared on it as well. And the Trump campaign, loads of people tweeted this, like, haha, this is funny. At this stage, the Hillary Clinton campaign got involved and said, posted just the most ridiculously naive thing on their on her website about Pepe the Frog, and kind of correctly calling out the fact that, oh my god, they've been tweeting this, what has become a horrible Nazi symbol. But the problem is, of course, it's essentially a campaign run by internet trolls. And one of the things they said is that Donald Trump is their god emperor, their king troll, you know, the ultimate troll. He's trolling Western democracy. And then Pepe the Frog, the troll symbol, is co-opted by Donald Trump, so that's even better. And then Hillary Clinton posts this thing complaining about it on her website, and so she has just been trolled by the God Emperor trolls and Pepe the Frog. So all of their crazy stuff that was kind of started as a weird joke in a horrible back corner of the internet has gone completely overground, and this unreal thing has taken over mainstream politics. And that, you know, at this point nothing is crazy anymore, and lo and behold, a reality TV star became president a few weeks later.
And in a way, I guess, doesn't that bring us back to where you were talking about these kind of different views of history? Because in a way it's sort of, you know, is it sort of great people that make history, or is it, you know, forces? And in a way, sort of Pepe the Frog is this kind of weird combination of the two. It's it's a kind of a social phenomenon that is kind of embodied in this case by a cartoon frog.
Yeah. I can't even say anything about that.
Yeah.
The cartoon frog is this, you know, a Nazi frog is a symbol of our age. What a world we live in.
And I believe the artist has killed him off, right? He's tried to anyway.
Yeah, I mean, this is really tragic. So the artist, from what I can make out, is quite a sweet, gentle guy, and is mortified that his frog has become this symbol, and has tried to kill him off. I think the most recent thing I read is that he actually has a campaign which might still be running on Kickstarter to try and draw a whole load of positive Pepe the Frog cartoons, and kind of to fight back and push back, and good luck to him.
I think before we just open to questions from the audience, one thing, and then we'll finish with a reading of the final entry in the book. But I should also say that we've talked about like a lot of kind of grand themes and big figures, but one of the things I loved about the book as well is you're not averse to petty gripes as well. I mean, there are two that particularly stuck out to me. Was one of the things you level at Tony Blair is his abuse of the English language. The fact that almost everything he said was prefaced by what I'll say to you is, and before saying, as you point out, almost nothing.
Yeah.
And although my particular favourite was a gripe you had against Osama bin Laden for giving us vlogging, so video logging. So all of these teenagers who record themselves and put themselves on YouTube telling you about their life, that was essentially kicked off by bin Laden.
Well, that's putting it quite strongly. He was certainly one of the pioneers and one of the first, and he was very early with the "look at me, I'm on the camera" kind of, and in a way, I mean, it's difficult laughing at Osama bin Laden, isn't it? Except we must, because he was an idiot, and this is one of the things that has to be said about these people. He was just he was a fool with power and who did terrible things, but essentially you look at him on posing with the gun, like, what a knob. And lo and behold, everything he stood for has gone up in flames, and his aims are not going to come to pass. And yet he has influenced vlogging, which hopefully he would have absolutely hated to think that this would be his biggest influence.
Then again, as you point out, when they searched his home after he'd been captured and killed, they found lots of Coke, Pepsi, and hardcore pornography on his hard drive, which, again, it's that kind of hypocrisy.
Yeah, it wasn't known whether it was necessarily his hard drive, but it was certainly within the compound, and so... Okay.
Again, that's in case bin Laden's lawyers come on to us, we're... mustn't misrepresent him. Let's not be unfair. Okay, over to you guys. Does anybody have a question for Sam? Anything you'd like to bring up? Raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Yeah, this gentleman here.
Hello, thank you for presenting your book to us. I'm not sure I quite grasped what was your goal by writing it. Was it to express your feelings, to raise awareness?
Yeah, both of those things, I think. I mean, in a way, it was cathartic, and hopefully it's cathartic to read it. And, it's just, it's making jokes and trying to be funny, and also to express anger. But it is information as well, and it's to set the record straight, and to, so that we know our enemies, essentially, to go back to Rage Against the Machine. In fact, I was listening to a lot of Rage Against the Machine when I was kind of up late at night writing it, and there is so Rage Against the Machine. It suddenly seems all too prescient and wise. Their lyrics. So it was, so we have an arsenal of facts and we know these things. And so there's been so much misinformation. And so, for instance, Boris Johnson, when I was writing about him and researching, I was like, oh my God, the nonsense he spouted about the European Union and so much. I mean, are there many British people here tonight who will have lived through this? The kind of stories of bendy bananas in the Telegraph and all this nonsense about EU regulations, which essentially sprang up because of Boris Johnson. One of his most famous stories was that he said the EU Commission building was full of asbestos and was going to have to be blown up. And it's in the middle of Brussels, and like the last thing you're going to do in the middle of a world capital is blow up a building full of asbestos and kill millions of people. But this was a story that ran in the British papers and just went with it. And obviously Boris Johnson knew it's not true. And so all these people have been falsifying the record. And to go back to, we've been living in a world of false economics as well. So there's a chapter on Milton Friedman. And essentially, Milton Friedman, although he again is one of the clever people in the book, but he was just making stuff up. And it's based on a foundation of nothing. So he would be writing stories, for instance, about Soviet Russia and how things work there, and you think, hang on, you're writing this in 1979, you don't know this detailed stuff about Soviet Russia. Like, no one knows, because it's been a closed society. It's so transparent that he does not have a factual basis for what he's saying, and yet so much of our world is based on Milton Friedman. So if you've ever heard people talking about the discipline of the markets, in the UK especially, Tory politicians just parrot straight Milton Friedman. They might not realise it comes directly from him, although, of course, Margaret Thatcher, as well as Pinochet, was one of his closest friends. So, there is a direct lineage there. But so it's to set the record straight. The record has been falsified, and, everything we can do to push back is important. And obviously this is, in some ways, a silly book with bum jokes, but it does have this important thing of pushback as well.
Bum jokes do not undermine the seriousness of anything. And in fact, when you look at the references at the back, and in fact, if you look on our website, Sam did a bookshelf for us of some of the texts that influenced the reading, and there's a lot of there's a lot of research behind this too.
Yes, there is a lot of research, yeah, and lots of it. I guess a lot of people in this room is just kind of sitting furiously looking at the internet thinking, oh my God, what's happening next? And reading The Guardian and despairing. So a lot of it was in my head already, and I'd read quite a lot of these books, but there were quite a few things I picked up again. There's a brilliant book, in fact, I hope you have it here, it might have gone out of print, Francis Wheen, How Mumbo Jumbo Conquered the World, which I think came out around the year 2000, which I read then. And
I can confirm we have it.
Great, good. Pick up all the copies. Hopefully all of those will sell tonight as well, because it's great, it's tremendous. And so I've always been reading things like that. So,
more questions, raise your hand. There's a lady at the back there, and there was another here afterwards. Okay.
So, Sam, you've identified who your enemies of the people are. Do you have like a flip list of people who are going to be our saviors or heroes?
Yeah, I wish I did. Especially in the UK, we don't have anyone, and this is part of the problem. We've got our political class is so bad and has let us down so badly, and it's so unfit for purpose. So they're really, it is terribly depressing. I don't know. I mean, I have thought about who would appear on the alternate list of kind of good people. Taylor Swift. I don't know. I liked, there's a UK politician, Ed Miliband, who, there's this great Twitter feed called the Milliverse. So if he had won the 2015 general election and we hadn't gone through Brexit, instead Ed Miliband was the politician, and like the kind of the wonderful petty stuff we would be complaining about now, instead of the fact that everything's on fire. So I think about this alternative universe sometimes.
There was one kind of thought exercise I went through while reading the book, because I thought, maybe one accusation that might be levelled against it is this is a liberal bubble. These are kind of, there are some which are maybe obvious targets. Like, if someone with opposing political views, what sort of book would they write, and who would be in that? And I started coming up with things like, oh God, probably be Nelson Mandela and the suffragettes. Oh God, no, these people are really good people. Like, there's almost like there's no alternative book, or maybe there is. I don't know.
Well, I mean, this book is kind of a snapshot, so very much it's the right wing at the moment, and there's a few that left. Chairman Mao's in there, for instance, because he has his lineage is still influenced an awful lot of the way things are happening. But people like, I don't know, like Stalin is not in the book, for instance, and I'm in no way apologising for Stalin's horrible crimes, but in this phase where we are less of an influence, so less relevant to the book, but maybe in 10 years' time we'll have a whole different set. So these things are cyclical, I think.
Okay, there's a gentleman just there.
One of the reviewers of your book mentioned that you didn't have anything to say about Rupert Murdoch, and I wonder if you want to say something about that.
What do I? Yes, well, this is a difficult subject because the book is published by HarperCollins, and who Rupert Murdoch owns, and he very generously, indirectly, but did pay me some money, and so I can't say anything against him. Essentially, is what. So this has been it's a glaring omission in the book, and what happened was that he was taken out, essentially, but not through anything I wanted to happen, or my editor. In fact, I still don't know what happened. So I did have this very funny phone call from my editor when she said, actually, I probably can't speak about this on the phone because of the notorious history of phone hacking. But essentially the good news was it looked like the book was going to be doing quite well. The bad news was it kind of escalated up the News International hierarchy, and someone somewhere said no, this isn't going to happen. And one thing that happened to my editor was, I don't know if anyone remembers, there was a book a politician in the UK wrote about Hong Kong. The politician was called Chris Patton, and he was going to publish that with HarperCollins, and this was around the time when Rupert Murdoch wanted to do a big deal with China, and the urban myth, I don't know the facts about it, but the story that certainly percolates around the HarperCollins office is that the first they knew about the fact that the book wasn't happening was when two big guys came into the office and then left the office again with the editor walking backwards with his feet furiously pedaling in the air behind them, and they were like, okay, so maybe the Hong Kong book's not happening. And so my editor started hearing stories like that, and it was her idea, so I had a debt to her, didn't want to get her into trouble, and she's a fantastic editor. So we had to make an unfortunate series of compromises. But the funny thing was, one of the first compromises we did, we were going to do a chapter on Mr. Burns, because anyone who watches The Simpsons will know, of course, that Mr. Burns is Rupert Murdoch. And it kind of, it's all a bit murky what came out, but essentially it came out that we couldn't do Mr. Burns because he doesn't know that he is Mr. Burns, hilariously, even though it's been running for 30 years or whatever. And he even appeared on The Simpsons and said, hello, I'm billionaire tyrant Rupert Murdoch, not realising that apparently, who knows what the truth is. It's all, so the way things operate, it's been a real insight into, how these big operations work and the power structures. He personally, I bet he doesn't care if he's in this book at all. And he's far too powerful to know or care about me, but someone somewhere got scared, essentially. The thing I decided in the end is actually it's no bad thing for the book, because this fear became the lightning rod. So all of the concerns of the sinister men in suits were focused on Rupert Murdoch, and so they didn't question anything else in the book, so everything else got through. So he gave me a pass to speak as clearly and truthfully as I wanted to, and who knows, maybe one day the full edition will come out, but
or maybe tonight after the reading, if people want, you can whisper it in their ears.
That's right. I do have the chapter, yeah.
Off the record. It'll be passed around in brown envelopes. I think we should wrap up quite soon, but we did want to finish with the final extract, which there's a very specific reason that it's a final one. I won't say what that is. I think I just hand it over to you. So over to you. Read us out.
Great. So this is John Romulus Brinkley. Has anyone heard of him out of interest? Okay, great, good. John Romulus Brinkley was a doctor, except he wasn't. He had some medical training, but he bought his medical degree from a diploma mill, glorying in the name of the Kansas City Eclectic University in 1915. But that's not why he's so fascinating. He's interesting because of what he did a few years later, after he had established a clinic in a small rural Kansas town called Milford. Brinkley's big moment came when a patient came to him complaining he was a flat tire, which is to say, impotent. Brinkley would later write that he reluctantly told the man there was nothing he could do for him, but that then the two fell to chatting. For some reason the subject of goats came up, and the fact that billy goats were always ready for action. And just to interrupt myself one last time, I actually have worked as a goat herd in the Ardèche, which is just blissful, and I was there in the mating season, and billy goats are always ready for action. It's extraordinary and terrifying to behold. It's like a terrible, really bad Benny film sketch with them just chasing the women everywhere. Anyway, so this is true, as is everything else, although you might not believe it because it is incredible. So Brinkley cracked a joke about putting a pair of those buck glands in you. Immediately the patient began to beg him to perform the operation. So Brinkley did. Yes, he did. He put goat testes in the man's own ball sack. Stranger still, people began to think that this was a good idea. Miraculously, the patient's wife gave birth to a baby boy, and soon Brinkley was declaring his goat gonads treatment a universal panacea, saying it cured all manner of ailments in both men and women. So many people started demanding the operation that Brinkley ran out of goats, and patients had to bring their own. He even carried out his operation on one of the editors of the Los Angeles Times. The editor survived in the short term. The operation was considered a success, and there came more publicity and more patients. Brinkley became very rich. He charged top dollar to perform his nutty operations, and Milford was flooded with people sold on the idea that their problems might be so easily solved. The fake doctor thought about opening a clinic in LA, but the state of California wisely refused to recognise his medical certification, declaring his resume to be riddled with lies and discrepancies. So, Brinkley determined that people should continue to come and see him in Kansas instead, and he had a great new way of reeling them in. While he'd been in LA, Brinkley had seen an early radio station and realised that the new technology had huge untapped potential as an advertising medium. In 1923, he set up his own commercial station, the world's first, KFKB, Kansas First, Kansas Best. He used the airwaves to shamelessly market his goat gland treatments, preying on the sexual and physical insecurities of his listeners. But along the way, he also invented a whole new format, mixing his adverts with weather reports for his rural audience, with fundamentalist preaching, with long homely chats in his sonorous voice, and with early country music, another first. Brinkley became famous. Agents from California, who were clamping down on diploma mills, came to arrest him in 1924, but by that time he was so rich, bringing in so much money from medical tourism and donating so much money to his local town, that the governor of Kansas refused to let them take him. "We people here in Kansas get fat on his medicine," said the governor. "We're going to keep him here so long as he lives." Okay. You might now be thinking that Brinkley provides some kind of all-encompassing metaphor for everything else in this book. It's hard not to draw parallels from this man who invented commercial talk radio and commercial religious radio, who inadvertently popularised country music, who was obsessed by impotence, and who built thousands of people out of their money by giving them goat balls. But hold off. There's more. Brinkley carried on, pumping out radio adverts and pumping up the balls of thousands of citizens. He sometimes performed the operation when drunk. He often performed it in less than sterile conditions. He knew it was entirely bogus. But who was going to say so? His patients either enjoyed a placebo effect or were too embarrassed by the sexual nature of their treatments to go public. I mean, few of us would like to admit to having allowed someone to put goat balls into our own body after all. But things came to a head after Brinkley started inviting people to write into his radio show with their medical problems and prescribe treatments for them on air. Treatments, not coincidentally, that involved buying his own patent medicines, often little more than coloured water, but sometimes dangerously poisonous, from approved pharmacies. he started making yet more money. But now the body count was rising. It's known that 42 people died in his clinics alone, but hundreds, this is the astonishing thing, possibly thousands more, must have expired after he let them walk out with goat balls or prescribed them dodgy medicines on air. In 1930, the Kansas Medical Board revoked his fake license to practice medicine, and the Federal Radio Commission also moved against his radio station. But before the authorities managed to shut him down, Brinkley made an audacious move. He stood for election as governor of Kansas. The story is familiar. It's unbelievably familiar. So he stood for election. The political establishment didn't take him seriously at first. He would rant and rave at his rallies. He declared he had suffered persecution no more justified than the persecution of Christ. He promoted contradictory policies. He promised to combat the drought in Kansas by putting a new lake in every county, although he never explained how he would do it or how the lakes would work. But Brinkley had huge advantages. He had a new way of talking directly to rural voters with his radio show. He whizzed around in his private plane. He dazzled people with his wealth and his attacks on the establishment. I know. You're thinking he's a metaphor again. But wait. Brinkley didn't actually win the election. He filed his application too late for his name to be printed on voting slips, and so became a write-in candidate. 3 days before the election, the Kansas Attorney General announced that rules for such candidates had changed, and that in order for their vote to count, people had to spell their chosen candidate's name correctly. And that's bad news for a radio star with a poorly educated constituency. More than 50,000 ballots were discounted by the new rules, and Brinkley narrowly lost. But he wasn't done yet. He moved to Texas and set up a radio station just over the border in Mexico to get around his broadcasting ban. He installed a transmitter so powerful that it made locals' bed strings hum and their car lights flash on and off. He started beaming out his adverts all over the USA and started allowing other quacks and hucksters to advertise on his airwaves. He became more famous and richer than ever. He had his name emblazoned on the side of his Cadillac and displayed in lights on the side of his giant pink mansion. He also took a trip to Europe, where he found Hitler's ideas chimed perfectly with his own increasingly rabid anti-Semitism. When he returned, he had his swimming pool lined with swastikas. And now, at last, Brinkley really is a metaphor for our times. But he does at least offer us some hope, because his vanity eventually caused his own downfall. Throughout his long, nefarious career, the fake doctor had been dogged by Morris Fishbein of the American Medical Association. It was he who had provided the evidence to Californian legislators when Brinkley failed to get a license there, and he who had helped move the actions that forced his nemesis out of Kansas. In 1938, Fishbein had the genius idea of outrageously libeling the quack, writing a series of articles denouncing Brinkley as a charlatan, impugning his character, and detailing the crimes in his career. Brinkley took the bait and sued. The case was a sensation. Things quickly turned against the goat-gonad pioneer when it became clear that he didn't even know the quantities of ingredients that went into most of his medicines, and it was shown that there were no proofs for the efficacy of his procedures. The jury stated he should be considered a charlatan and a quack in the ordinary, well-understood meaning of those words. Word was out, finally and undeniably. Immediately, hundreds of former patients sued him for malpractice. The IRS began to investigate him for tax evasion, and the Post Office Department for mail fraud. He was declared bankrupt and died in 1942, penniless, disgraced, and, most importantly, unable to harm anyone anymore.
Sam Jordison, everyone. Enemies of the people. And that is it for the summer season. But please do stick around, have a glass of wine with us. We have stacks of Sam's book at the front. Pick one up. Sam will be here signing them. Thank you so much for coming to all the events this summer. Hope to see as many of you as possible in September if you're still around. But one more time, please do give it up for Sam Jordison.
Thank you very much.